calendar, and it is a rainy Friday, although nicely warm in Providence. It is somewhat of a tragic weekend. 20 years ago on Monday is the anniversary of the station fire. We've reached out to Scott James. He is the author of the book Trial by Fire, probably the most complete examination of this horrific episode in Rhode Island history. And we've got him Skyping in here. Scott James, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Josh.
Scott, you're a top-tier journalist. You've won Emmys. This book, you've got lots of ties to Rhode Island and southeastern Mass. Talk a little bit about what attracted you to even begin to take on the very difficult task about writing about something like this. For all of us, when we do have to do journalism on stuff like this, it obviously has an impact on us. It's tough reporting. Talk a little bit about your experience.
Well, I grew up there, and I really consider the station nightclub fire to be the worst thing that happened where I grew up. I mean, I knew people who were there that night, worked with people who lost loved ones in the fire. I grew up in that area, but then later came back and was a news director at Channel 6 for a number of years. So there were all sorts of ties that I had to that tragedy for people who were there or connected to it. And I've since, like a lot of news people, a journeyman, I've been working around the world, and I was based out in California, but I would come home and see my family often. And when I would come home, people would say they thought they never really knew the truth or didn't know the full story about what happened that night 20 years ago. So after hearing this for a number of years, I decided I would just start asking some questions. And it didn't take me long to figure out that, in fact, people hadn't been told the whole story, that key people had never spoken publicly. Several, in fact, had never told their stories. So there were gaps of information that I thought needed to be filled. But of course, this is a tragedy where 100 people died, hundreds were hurt. Every single one of those people deserves to have their story told. And I think we want to think of them this Monday on the 20th anniversary and grieve the loss and remember the people who were involved in this terrible tragedy. And so it's going to be a very solemn day. And I think you're going to feel that on Monday. But in tackling this as a journalist, of course, you can't tell completely the stories of hundreds of people and put it in just one book. So I had to select a handful of people who I really felt were representative of the types of people who were drawn into this awful night and the impact afterwards, and kind of tell their story before, during, and after that terrible night.
Scott, what was the biggest, most compelling experience you found of those who survived the tragedy?
Well, I think probably the story, and she's quite well known there to Rhode Islanders, is Gina Russo. Gina Russo is, her story opens the book. It's chapter 1. Right. She goes to the nightclub that night with her fiance, Freddie. And it was kind of a twist of fate that brought them there. They had other plans that fell through or things weren't working out, and they decided at the last minute then to go to this show. And so she's there and is right near the stage when the fire breaks out. She becomes one of the most injured survivors of this terrible fire. And you would think, a person like that would be the end of their story, but not with Gina. Gina not only overcame her injuries, but she actually ended up leading the survivors of the fire and eventually raised the money to help the people who needed help, and then eventually really was the driving force behind building that memorial down in West Warwick, where people are going to be on Monday. The memorial that is just an unbelievable place to go and to think about what happened. But that's Gina. Her story is fascinating that as she's coming out of her injuries and she's realizing all that she's lost, she becomes a very angry person, like so many in the state. They were so hurt. It's hard really to overstate how devastated the community was by this fire. And Gina was among them. And somehow, and you see it evolve in the pages of telling her story, she evolves from being this person who is really hate and anger is the only thing holding her together, to a person who just becomes an incredible inspiration. It's one of those stories that just really sticks with you about something good that ultimately came out of something really, really awful.
Well, Scott, talk a little bit about, as a journalist, you had done your research, you'd read the media coverage in the past, you'd probably had some initial conversations with some people, and you really got into the meat and potatoes of doing your examination. What was the biggest aha moments? Like, oh my God, I've never seen this before. I hadn't read about this before. What were those ahas that you were able to uncover during the course of developing this book?
I think there were a couple of things that really stuck out in my mind, and one, of course, became a turning point and became the moment when I decided this would actually be a book. But one of the things that was done, the story, of course, was all-encompassing for the media covering it at the time. But over the course of years, there was litigation that had a lot of the court documents. In fact, the grand jury transcripts were made public. It's very unusual.
Yeah,
So there's a
absolutely.
treasure trove of information that it came out, but not immediately, not when the story was happening, and certainly not even in the initial years. It came out later. So I had the ability to access all of that information. And there was a moment where I came across a document that showed that, in fact, something that people just take for granted as a fact was simply not true. And that was involved the phone. Now, to remind people about this tragedy, this is a fire where the group Great White let off fireworks inside a nightclub. The fire spread very, very quickly because the walls of the nightclub were covered in this very highly flammable hacking foam. It's like solid gasoline. And if you were in that building 90 seconds after that fire first started, you probably didn't make it. So this foam on the walls was supposed to be there to protect from sound. It was supposed to insulate the sound so that the sound didn't bother the neighbors from the nightclub. And sound foam, by law, is supposed to be not flammable. It's supposed to be fire retardant. So one of the things that was said often during the course of the investigation afterwards is that the nightclub owners had, very cheaply bought cheap packing foam instead of sound foam, and that's why all these people were dead. And in fact, I found a receipt in these, or an order form, I should say, from the nightclub owners to the foam company, and it specifically says they ordered sound foam. This is a revelation to me, and I remember going to the brothers afterwards, the Dudarian brothers who owned the nightclub, and saying to them, "Who has seen this besides me?" And their response, "Well, we got it from the government." And of course, that made sense because their own records all burned in the fire. So the only people who had access to do, search warrants and subpoenas and things like that was the government. So this was a document that the government itself had, and yet spun the story in a completely different way that fit their narrative of what they wanted to do legally, but was not really 100% the story, the correct story.
Yeah, I mean, you brought so many things out, failures in press coverage at the time, et cetera. What was your biggest, I don't know, disappointment in looking at sort of how the media covered this? I mean, listen, I was not in the media. This happened years before GoLocal was established. I remember exactly where I was, exactly what time. And I knew that club, I knew the owners, I knew people who were there. This is Rhode Island, we all know each other.
Right.
What was that aspect of it that, you're disappointed in sort of the brethren, or was it just the speed in which things happen? Journalism fails sometimes.
Well, there's definitely, you have that expression, the fog of war. We hear that now, when there's an overwhelming catastrophe happening, journalists are also overwhelmed.
Right.
No question about it, that it's hard to keep up with the facts, and sometimes the facts suffer at the beginning. But this was a story that was covered over the course of years and years and years. And I think that what was disappointing to find out was that after the media sued to gain access to all of these documents that really are bring incredible insight to what happened that night, I'm not sure that anyone actually read them. Now, at that point, it might have been exhaustion because it was like years after the cases were all settled. But I have to say, if you're going to sue and say, I want access to this stuff, and it comes out, then you should look at it. Some things that really bother me, honestly, and it's interesting in 2023, they're more topical today than they were then. But today we talk about something called doxing. Doxing is when a media organization or somebody uses social media to publish very private information about somebody, like their home address, because they're in the public eye and this may cause them to be harmed. And as you know, we have a lot of crazy people out there who might harm somebody if they had their home address. And I couldn't believe it when I saw that the Providence Journal, at the height of the anguish over this tragedy, published the home addresses of the nightclub owners. There was no reason to do that. There was no journalistic reason to do that. And they certainly didn't publish the home address of the leader of the rock band, Jack White, or the roadie who set off the fireworks that caused all this, or the foam company people. To me, that was an early example of doxing, and certainly it was not journalistic standards to do something like that. It seemed provocative, possibly punishing even, because as you probably know, the brothers never did talk to the news media. They remained silent because there were never any trials. Everything was plea bargained. They never got their spoke in court. In fact, I was the first person that they did an interview with many, many, many years later. So that was surprising that aggressive tactics like that were used at the time.
Talk a little bit about, was this a failure of Rhode Island regulations, local government, et cetera? Or was this everything went wrong, this could have happened anywhere in the United States? What's your takeaway on that? I know you're not the ultimate juror, you're the fact finder, you're not the judge and jury.
Well, that's a really good point. What I tried to do in this book was to kind of lay the facts out there and let people decide for themselves. But I think you're onto something here. The fact is that the state wasn't well regulated when it came to fire codes. And so, for example, there were no sprinklers in that building.
Right.
And we know because a similar incident, almost exactly the same, happened a few days earlier in Minneapolis, where a rock band came in, set off fireworks inside a nightclub, and there was flammable materials on the walls, and the place went up like a torch. But there, they had sprinklers, and the fire was put out, and not a single person was even injured. So we know that that sprinklers prevent people from being killed. So, but this was the perfect storm of fires. People have used that expression, and I think it's quite accurate. So many things went wrong simultaneously. Frankly, if just one thing had not gone wrong, I think everyone would have survived. But not having proper fire codes, not having sprinklers, not having proper inspections of buildings, these things, Rhode Island owns that. And in fact, they paid millions and millions of dollars in fines related to their own participation in this by not having doing things properly. It's also very telling that in the aftermath, things changed. This fire changed not just Rhode Island, it changed the United States and to the world to a certain extent. One of the terrible twists of this fire was that it was all captured on videotape. There happened to be a local TV news photographer on site there working on, ironically, a story about public venue safety and was shooting what's called B-roll, generic B-roll. He captured the whole thing on tape. The camera just rolls the entire time. So this is really the most documented fire in modern American history. And in fact, it is studied by all of the experts. It's used as a teaching tool on how fires spread, because we know second by second by second what happened. So fire codes changed after this. The organization that was supposed to be setting the standards for buildings code standards, there was a terrific story done by 60 Minutes and really put them on the hot seat and said, wait a minute, so why did you sign off on these lax building standards? So, and really did what 60 Minutes does really well and kind of eviscerated these people. And like the next day, they changed the standards, not just for Rhode Island, but for the whole country.
Yeah.
But, and there's a big but here, and yet we've seen the same thing happen again. Even in recent years, there was the Ghost Ship fire in Oakland, California. Different situation, but similar in that it was a place where people were gathered to listen to music and have fun. And it was a highly flammable place, not properly inspected, despite calls from the neighbors to inspect this place and regulate it. And 34 people died in a terrible fire there. So it can happen again. It has happened again. And so it's a cautionary tale. We need to keep our eye on this. And yeah, the government there let people down by not having a properly regulated system.
Scott, your book became the subject of a 48-hour special. I believe it's up for an Emmy. Is that, that manifestation, that extension of your book onto network television, does that help to sort of re-educate government in being vigilant on these things? Listen, the impact for my family is first thing we do when we go into a theater, a concert, a game is look around for what's the exit.
Right.
I mean, literally the first thing you do. If you live in Rhode Island, it's almost ingrained in you, I think. I'm not sure that has had, obviously, the same impact. What's been the outcome from the book, from 48 Hours, et cetera?
Well, I think, Josh, it's not just Rhode Island. I think that when anyone sees this tragedy, hears about it, it does become part of your operating method to check for exits wherever you go. I have to say, I do it. A lot of people do it. Anyone who's familiar with this does it. So I think that, what's interesting about the 48 Hours piece was, of course, they're doing an hour of television as opposed to an entire book, so they have to be very selective what they included in it. But I don't think the government of Rhode Island came off, honestly, very well in that. They confront the former Attorney General Patrick Lynch about key information that was withheld, not just from the public, but even from the defense. Whistleblower information about the foam company playing fast and loose with rules that may have really led to one of the key problems with this tragedy. And his answer was, they should just shut up. I was like thinking, what? Not like, oh, I disagree with that, or show me the receipts. It was basically, they should shut up. To me, that's not what we want. We want to have a discussion about what really happened. We want the truth to come out to prevent something like this happening again. And I can tell you, there are people who lost loved ones, not all of them, because some people have really struggled to move forward or at all since of this, which happened, which of course is understandable. But there are people who have said they just don't understand what happened, and they would like to have all the information presented to them so they can come to their own conclusions. And shut up is not an answer.
Yeah. Scott, last word to you. What do you say after you spent years on this? What's the message for the families, the community, Rhode Island and beyond? What's your takeaway, and what do you hope takes place?
Well, look, the message right now, and I think we want to be really sensitive about this, is that whenever these anniversaries come up, and 20th is a big one, it's really hard for these people. They need their time to grieve. They need their time to just think about their loved ones or their own journeys that they've had for survival. And I think we should hold those people in our hearts, especially on Monday. If you are in Rhode Island, or if you are near Rhode Island, I would say you should go to that memorial, because it's an incredible place, and it's a place where you can walk around and really think about not just that tragedy, but it makes you think about life and whether or not you're living your best life, because these people had their lives snuffed out at such a young age, and there's so many of them. It's really a kind of an incredible place to go. But I would say this: if you're going to go, don't go on Monday. I would let the families have that place to themselves on Monday, but go later and see it and think about what happened, and think about your own life and whether or not you're living your best life. I think that's something to take out of this. Too many people gone way, way too soon.
Scott James, want to thank you for taking the time. Scott James, top-tier journalist and author of the book Trial by Fire, really the examination of the tragic station fire, which took place 20 years ago on Monday. I want to thank you for taking the time to join us. I know all Rhode Islanders appreciate your expertise on this and what you've done in being able to put this book forward. For everybody else, stay tuned. There's a lot of news breaking on a rainy Friday in Providence. We'll have an update on a series of stories that we've been working on all week. We'll be going out at e-blast in about an hour, so stay tuned for that. Enjoy this great weekend. We have a lot of news coming up over the weekend. Stay safe. If you haven't gotten that last vaccination, do it. Rhode Island Hospital emergency room is still jam-packed. You don't want to be there. Stay safe. Thanks, everybody.